She has the illustrious credential of being the first paid employee of the Workers' Health Centre after its establishment at the Old Trades Hall in 1981. She's had a diverse and extensive career in public health in Queensland and in the community. She's held various senior executive roles with Queensland Health. She was executive director of the Health Protection Branch, and in that capacity she managed the Health Protection Program, which sought to ensure that good health is maintained through preventing or minimizing the community's exposure to hazards and risk. She's completed undergraduate degrees in environmental science, has a Master of Public Health, and a graduate diploma in public sector management. She holds adjunct appointments with Griffith University as an associate professor, and also with the University of Queensland as an adjunct professor. She's chair of NHealth, a subcommittee of the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee, which addresses key environmental health matters at a national level, and a board member of Safe Food Production Queensland. She's a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. In 2006, she was awarded a Public Service Medal for outstanding service in the field of environmental health. That's a very impressive curriculum.
Dated one, well,
unfortunately, we don't have time for her presentation.
I'll get you in line too, because we just got to
okay, you're going to do it.
I saved the wrong version, didn't I?
And Terry, our other speaker, is one of the founding members of the Brisbane Workers' Health Collective, which was a forerunner to the Queensland Workers' Health Centre, which operated for a number of years from a Brisbane suburban house. Terry has been an activist for more than 50 years, particularly around industrial and racism issues. He worked as a researcher at the WHC from 1981 till 1989, while also completing postgraduate studies in occupational health and safety. After leaving the centre, Terry worked as a consultant and as an academic in occupational health and safety. Retired in 2005. He's a life member of the NTEU, and he served as a member of the NTU, he served as the branch president at QUT. He now spends his time, now I had to look this up to make sure I wasn't saying something inappropriate. He now spends his time protecting turtles and searching for nudie branches when diving on the Sunshine Coast. I had no idea what a nudie branch was. Is there anybody else who needs it?
Brank.
Nudie Brank.
Brank.
Brank. Yeah.
Nudie Brank.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, it's spelled like branch, but
Yeah.
Brank. Okay. Something for, I'm sure I'm not the only one who doesn't know what that is. Really?
Saying a lot about you, John. Move on.
Well, that's the last thing he's put in his biography, which is interesting. So I'll turn it over to you two guys.
My apologies. I have a few old resumes, and I kind of did it quickly for Deb because I'd forgotten to do it, and I saved the wrong one. So I've retired now from all of those things, and but what I think it does say is my early days in the Workers' Health Centre were instrumental in influencing me in my career, and as a consequence influenced government, and Deb also went into government, and Terry was involved, and local government with Helen. So those philosophies actually, and we do talk a little bit about this at the end, actually had an impact that went well beyond the Workers' Health Centre. But I took those lessons from my early career, that the teachings I kind of got from Terry and from Helen and colleagues, made it as part of the way I did my work in environmental health and public health. And funnily enough, the area that I managed was where occupational health was. So it was the oldest part, still is the oldest part of the health department, and it was where environmental health had occupational health in it. So it was headed up by Manny Rathers at its time. And I'm thinking, oh wow, what a... So I did say to his daughter, Zoe, you realise I was kind of the working grandchild of Matty Rathers, which I thought was ironic, to say the least. Anyone who knows about workplace health and safety history knows that there was very contentious arguments between the health department and its approach to occupational health. and what the Workers' Health Centre were on about. And that was actually really important, that the Workers' Health Centre stood up and challenged those. So I think that, ironic to say the least. So these are personal reflections from Terry and myself, and input from a group, so Deb and Helen involved, I think, in our conversations that led up to this presentation. Let's see if that, what am I pointing at? Something, no. Oh, that, no.
Is it the up the top one?
Up.
No, is that working? It's not working.
It's not working.
Shall I do it when you...
Yes. So we too want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, the Turrbal and Jagera people, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. It's very important to us both in our personal and work lives that we acknowledge the challenge, and particularly in public health, in health and well-being for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, given that it's NAIDOC week particularly. Next one. Oh, it might work now, you reckon? Yeah. So now over to Terry for the broader context on how it all emerged.
Okay. Well, the whole philosophy of the centre and the workers' health movement as a whole was very much influenced by the political environment at the time. And I think it's really educational to look back at some of that. And I'm actually going to start and talk a bit about the broader political movements, because this was at the time of the anti-Vietnam War movement, for example. And this was incredibly important and really influenced, I think, all of us in that a whole lot of things about it, but one of the things was that it brought academics, students and workers on the street together. And this is also at the same time as the Labor Party started to, well, following that I suppose, the Labor Party introduced universal education as well, and so we actually had working class people entering universities, so we had increased education there. But this mingling was really important because as a student at the time, that's how I became aware anyway of the conditions that workers were facing in a lot of workplaces. I actually, by some fluke, became the secretary of the one of the waterfront anti-Vietnam War movement committees. Can't remember what the name of it was now, but I got on board ships, saw asbestos and stuff like that in the ships and so forth, and started to understand a bit about working conditions. Started to talk to workers about about the risks, some of the hazards they were facing, the conditions they worked in. And one of the things that did, but also my own experience of working in industry a little bit later on, was it made me really aware of the importance of understanding why people do things the way they do them. Not just what they do, but why they do it. And that was a big underlying influence in the Workers' Health Centre, that we would always ask workers why they did something some way, because you'd often look at it from the outside and think, oh, you could do it this way, and it would be better. And then invariably you found out there was a very good reason for doing things differently. But bringing people together like that was really important, of increasing the awareness of working conditions. I can remember standing on I was actually in Sydney, and I was at a demonstration for a hazardous waste disposal site. And I was standing there, and there was a guy beside me, and he said, oh, what are the things that they dump here? And I rattled them off, couldn't remember what they were now. And he said, I work with those things in my workplace. And it was sort of like a shock, an awareness to him, an awareness to me, and that sort of thing was happening right throughout the movement. So that was a very important issue. Another one that was important, I think, in terms of, and there were other things that happened, but these are just things that stick in my mind, the women's health movement. And the women's health movement was really critical for the formation of the workers' health movement in Australia. The Lidcombe Workers' Health Centre and the Lidcombe Women's Health Centre, the Lidcombe Workers' Health Centre grew out of the Lidcombe Women's Health Centre, and particularly among migrant women and overuse injuries, or RSI it was known at that stage, an awareness of that and making that an industrial issue. But the movement generally was important as well, because it really raised the issue of a right to know. women, were demanding a right to know, a right to control their own bodies. They were sort of the keystone demands that I can remember of the women's health movement at the time. They, in a way, became keystone demands of the workers' health movement too. A right to know what we were working with, and a right to control things in our workplace. And so, things like the right to stop work and stuff like that were really influenced by the women's health movement. So it was really important, as well as just understanding that women obviously oftentimes had the worst jobs, highest stress jobs, the repetitive jobs, and so forth, and then migrant women and so forth down at the bottom of the ladder. So the women's health movement was very important. Another one that was important was the environment movement, and things like the green bans in New South Wales and the BLF had an incredible influence. These just started making people aware that there was more involved than just getting a salary, that there was the environment that we're in as well, that there were other things, that the quality of life that we were experiencing, and that sort of had a if you like, almost like the only word that's coming to mind is subterranean, but a subliminal sort of impact on us, where that thing about quality of life became important. One of the things that the Workers' Health Centre started to develop was the demand that you should come home from work feeling better than when you went. Now think about it for a moment. That sounds ridiculous. I mean, all our standards are developed so that you're well enough to go to work the next day. But really, if we go to work, we should come home feeling better. That's why we come together to work. It's why people came together to work. It's to improve quality of life. It's to improve our well-being. So that was one of the underlying, again, philosophies that we have, is that work should promote health and safety, not just allow survival to go to work the following day. So there are a whole lot of other things going on as well. There was a right to march movement in Queensland, things like that, which were all very important. In terms of Queensland, this was the days of Bjelke-Petersen, and the health and safety legislation here was less than hopeless. I won't go into the details of that. It's one of my favourite subjects, so I think I better avoid discussing what its limitations were. But suffice it to say that we never, in the early days of the Workers' Health Centre, even looked at the health and safety legislation. There were about 17 bits of different legislation that you had to work your way through anyway before it all came together. So that was just a mishmash. It was there to really support employers and very little value at all to workers. So, and that I think covers the state of workplace health and safety as well, is that there was very little information available. The health and safety profession was there to serve employers. We had the doctors were probably the worst of the bunch, that would sort of deny health and safety effects, deny that things were caused by, injuries were caused by the workplace. The unions were in a poor position. They didn't have a lot of information available to them. The standard response from a union official at the time, because of the lack of information, if somebody was injured to work, was, we'll get compensation for you. We'll make sure you get what's coming to you that way. There was very little involved in the way of prevention, and the whole thing about the Workers' Health Centre was the emphasis on prevention. We didn't really do anything to do with, we dabbled a little bit in workers' compensation around the edges, but only insofar as getting changes and trying to get improvements in prevention anyway. I think the first person that ever walked through the door at the house we used to operate in was a workers' compensation claim, and the one thing that convinced me is that wasn't a way that we should be going, because you had to be more social worker, I think, than activists to deal with workers' compensation claims, and that wasn't certainly not my make, or of the other people I think that were involved in the early days of the Workers' Health Centre. So that was sort of the general state of health and safety at the time, and the things that influenced us at the beginning, I think. Very quickly then, some of the brief history of what happened, if we can.
I won't do it. I won't do it. You need I wanted to fill it.
Yeah, just doesn't want to play ball.
It was interesting, just in terms of that separation between the state government and the trade union movement. After the Workers' Health Centre started, and we managed to encouraged the Labor Council to start up a health and safety committee, union health and safety committee. One of the first people we suggested we invite to there was David Smith, who was a doctor in the health department at the time, the section that Sophie was talking about, and we'd heard him speak, and he was actually quite sympathetic and had some good ideas, and we thought it would have been good to have him speak at the Trades and Labour Council committee meeting. The minister refused him permission to talk to the unions at the time, which gives you some sort of an understanding of what happened. Okay, so around about 1975 was when the idea of the Workers' Health Centre was first floated, and it was because of a Dr. Sue McCarthy, who was an activist in the Communist League and on the left generally at the time, was approached by a patient of hers. He suffered from industrial deafness, and I cannot remember his name, which really upsets me a lot. But somehow or other, she got hold of a copy of a magazine called Hazards from the UK by the British Society for Social Responsibility and Science, which had all of this interesting information on workplace hazards. And she said, do you think something like this might work here? Seemed like a good idea. So a number of us got together and formed a small committee with the idea of starting a workers' health centre at Dwyer Zetlin's house at Birdwood Terrace at Toowong at the time. And we formed a committee. It didn't go very far until 1979, when one of the people who were involved in that committee had moved to Sydney and started to work at the Lidcombe Workers' Health Centre. And Lidcombe was starting to get some requests coming from Queensland for information. And she came back up and said, are you still interested in the Workers' Health Centre? We said, yes, we are. So she said, well, here's some information. And we've got a cardboard box of leaflets and pamphlets and stuff like that. That's it, the Workers' Health Centre's on the table. So I can't remember the process exactly, but we had I know we formed a committee, we had a public meeting, people came along, including a mixture of unionists, social workers, students, odds and sods of people around the place, and that formed the committee, and we declared ourselves open as a Workers' Health Centre in 1979, operating from a cardboard box in a room at Dwyer Zetlin's place about once a month, I think. We slowly worked up from there, and to actually approaching the Trades and Labour Council. We developed a model that said that we wanted to be funded entirely by the trade union movement. Partly we knew we'd get no money from the state government anyway, where Lidcombe got a lot of their funding from there, but also that's who we wanted to be responsible to. We wanted to be independent from the trade unions in a lot of ways, but we also wanted to be responsible to the trade union. So a short leash, I suppose. And we approached the Trades and Labour Council. Di Priestley, there's a copy of her talk somewhere on one of those in the first hazards bulletins up the back there. And Di Priestley addressed the Labour Council. Fred Whitby was quite sympathetic, which surprised me because a number of us had been involved in quite hostile campaigns against the Labour Council for various things at the time as well. So, but you know, give him his credit. He could see beyond that, and to see what we were saying was fairly was worth supporting. We had a model of, I think, saying that we wanted the unions to fund us at 4 cents per member, and we wanted the Labour Council to impose that levy on the unions. They said, go and get it yourself. And so we came across Sophie, and we said, and we received some private funding, and we said, well, we can pay you about half a day's wage. Are you willing to work for 4 days? And so that was, so we employed Sophie. We used to make up wages. Debbie Lang used to arrive on the doorstep every Friday with a bottle of wine, which we then used to wander around Trades Hall and raffle to make up Sophie's wages a bit. I've forgotten her name. Came from Sydney. Anna Russell. God, it's true. It's old age, isn't it? Anna Russell came up from Sydney to work here with Sophie and set up the library, and to fill in her time I went down to Lidcombe and worked there to understand more about the centre. That was really important. The work that Anna and Sophie did then was just critical to the centre. We used to say, and I still say, that really the centre wasn't so much about the people as about the library. Without that library, we couldn't have done anything. It was critical for us. It gave us, and the way that it was set up gave us what was leading information probably in Australia, with the other workers' health centres combined, but certainly in Queensland. I found later that I speaking to some occupational health and safety professionals, and they said to me that when the Workers' Health Centre used to arrive for negotiations, they used to be shaking in their boots because we were always so well prepared and knew what we were talking about. What they didn't know is that we were shaking in our boots because we knew what we didn't know and we were worried about. But yeah, the library was incredible. We used to hang about and wait for the next issue of a journal, the Scandinavian Journal for Work, Environment and Health in particular. I can remember we used to wait for that to arrive and we'd devour the pages, and then we'd sort of contact unions and say, did you know about this, and so forth. So we started off with a handful of unions and paid some of Sophie's salary. The rest of it she just didn't get. And then we also received a little bit of funding as well after that to employ me as well for Anna. Oh, the name's up there, I should have known. And to employ me as well to increase, my job was supposedly to increase union subscriptions and support from trade unions, which I think is just something we all did rather than something that I did in particular. But Sophie at that stage was still a bit of an out-of-towner and didn't know her way around the union movement as well at that stage. She pretty quickly learnt that, but yeah, so it was just to sort of get that extra bit of going, and it also just having people to bounce ideas off, I think, helped us a hell of a lot. It helped increase our confidence, gave us other ways of looking at things, helped us develop the philosophy further, and I think Sophie will go on and talk a bit about some of that philosophy now.
Yes. Oh, and also then we should mention that Helen came on.
Oh yes, and then I forget when Helen came on, early 82?
Yeah, 82.
82, yes, and that was really a critical thing for the Workers' Health Centre too. A number of things that are important about that. One of them is that I always took credit for this, but it's not me at all, it's actually Helen, is that we decided in those early days not to open a medical centre. I had got that idea a bit from being at Lidcombe, just looking at the way the doctors chewed up resources. But Helen was really the key to that. She reminds me, or she didn't actually remind me, but hearing her talk just reminded me, that in fact, when she came on board, she said, I will not work as a doctor in the Workers' Health Centre. You don't want a medical centre. And that was really important. It was a key decision for us, I think, because it kept us out of a lot of that workers' compensation stuff. Helen did provide respectability to the union movement. We tended not to talk about qualifications to employers. We set out, that we'd often get asked, what authority do you speak with? And the answer would be along the lines of the support of the rank and file. Yeah. That's the authority that we have. It's not qualifications or anything like that, and Helen would do that as much as the rest of it. Every now and then we'd put out the doctor's hat if it was beneficial. But I think the union...
Can I just interrupt there? You can all see that Terry's a great planner and explainer of everything and what the industrial dispute was. So he would talk for 20 minutes when we're in negotiations and get involved in negotiations, and just about when I thought it was time to go home, he'd say, now Helen's a doctor and she'll talk, and I was always absolutely lost for words, didn't know where to go, and thought, am I a token or not?
Okay, but I think having Helen on board certainly impressed a lot of the unions, and the funding and support increased, as well as we started to get some runs on the board with the early campaigns.
Thank you. Okay, so let's look at what we're on about, and this is a summary of the objectives as printed out in the hazards bulletin. You'd see it there. You can see from it that the role was is fundamentally preventive in nature, which I think it was critical, rather than if your clinic would also not have been about prevention, it would have been about a clinical service, and I think that's just as important today as it was then. You can see that it was about information, it was empowering others through information. We were the translators, and in a funny way, with Helen with her expertise, but neither Helen, Terry or I had qualifications in occupational health and safety. But our job was to understand and learn from either the material that we had or experts that we could find. And until we understood it, we didn't feel like we were in a position to translate. So a lot of our job was to keep asking people, I don't understand what you're saying, please explain. This is to experts or the material, seek advice, so that we could translate that material. So as I said, that influence of being able to translate highly technical information into readily understandable information and usable facts and approaches was critical. And I'm thinking of one of the ways was to provide training, and we did a health and safety training, and Helen, your body in the workplace and the explanation of asbestos. I can still draw the little alveoli and the little thing and the scarring, and that in language I understood because I didn't have a medical degree, but by doing that I learned in depth about the real meaning of what the science was saying, and therefore when you read the literature it all made sense. So we're the gatekeepers, not quite, but translators of information, gatherers of information, packaging information, translating. So we were prepared because we actually understood it, had to understand it at a very fundamental level, and we were then able to engage with workers and pass that information on because we'd all were talking ordinary language instead of technical language. So you can see that reflected in the objectives of what we're on about with the representing of research. We had a bulletin, we did a lot of exchange of information, we did training, we worked with tutor, and we assisted workers investigate the workplace. Now that's very important because it wasn't us doing investigations, coming in as an expert, it was walking side by side with workers, respecting the knowledge of workers about their workplace and what was going on, and we would then bring what information we had and meld that together with their knowledge to actually then identify what should be done about a particular problem. And I think that'll come clear when we talk about some of the examples. So this is the first run of requests, some of the data that we were able to track down, which was great. So we would have people would ring up and we would define each job as a request, and this was the tracking of a financial year's requests. You can see in those early stages that asbestos was big, as was chemicals and repetitive strain injury or overuse injuries, VDU hazards or ergonomics. I mean, the language has changed a lot now, but those were the top issues, and air conditioning came along as well. So they were the top issues that we faced early on, and I think we'll go through some of those campaigns.
Sophie, before you move on, can you move back to that slide? Sorry.
Can I move back? No, I can't.
No, you can't. Okay.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, just for those of us who are old and don't have very good sight, could you just read each of those labels?
So, air conditioning,
Okay.
asbestos, biological hazards,
Okay.
compensation, still a little bit around compensation, dusts and fumes, chemicals, repetitive strain injury, RSI, VDU, visual display units, computers,
That's more or less ergonomic.
ergonomics,
Yeah.
sitting at a computer,
Okay.
as well as concerns about emissions, eyesight and the like, and noise.
Thank you.
So that was the range of the early, and I don't know how it changed over the years. I think the asbestos.
Well, it's interesting that what happened over the years, that some of those ones, like the asbestos requests declined. So, and it wasn't because asbestos wasn't an issue, but the information was out there. So this will come up in a minute, but I'll do it now, is that as we got information out, the unions became better armed themselves to deal with the issues. So we produced a report that the first asbestos report we produced was quite a detailed report. As we'll go on to the next slide. And it actually tried to contain, within it, the way that we used to write our arguments is we used to try and foresee the arguments that the worker or an official or whoever we're writing to might have with the employer. So we try and put the counters to those arguments in the report that we wrote. And I'm told by a number of officials that the asbestos report was incredibly important that way for them, because they could go to a meeting with the report under their arm, they'd get an argument, and the counter argument would be in the report that we wrote for them. So then the request for asbestos information dropped. As well as that, with Tutor initially and the TLC Health and Training Unit, with Deb in particular, later on, we were educating the rank and file as well, providing them with the information, giving them handouts, producing fact sheets and things like that, so they could actually use it without having to ask us for help. And you know, the basic philosophy was to enable the rank and file to fight these issues themselves. We didn't fight them. We couldn't fight them. You know, we had no industrial power. We had no right of access to workplace. We could only be in a workplace if we're invited there by the workers. And you know, we relied very much on that rank and file support and tried to build that rank and file activity to get things done. Remember, the legislation was of no real use anyway. And in fact, I think, you know, as people became to rely on the legislation more than the rank and file, that's when we started to lose battles. So yeah, it was really important that we build up that power of the rank and file to achieve change. The asbestos issue, as we've said, was one of the initial issues that we took on in a big scale. Overuse injuries and asbestos, I think, there are two big initial ones, and chemicals is in there with that, and that's reflected in the request. That was where there was a demand for information, where the information was hard to sort out. The asbestos was interesting. It was raised by a telecom technician in the SGIO building first up. The ATA at the time had been one of the first unions to support the Workers' Health Centre, more because they thought it was a good idea to support something like that than any real commitment to the or feeling that they need it. But what happened is when the technician raised the question of asbestos in the SGIO building with them, the officials at the time said, "We're paying money to the Workers' Health Centre, let's see what they can do." And we worked really hard to produce what was, I think, one of the a really good report on asbestos. I have to dig through the files, see if I can find it sometime. It may not be what I remember it as, but we produced that report. We went into battle about asbestos, particularly initially at the SGIO building. I said before, we never entered a workplace without an official. There's one exception to that I can think of, and that was when we were in the Trades Hall. The Trades and Labour Council gave us reduced rent. I think it was $6 a week or $9 a week or something or other for the old, was it the old ETU offices?
Yeah, I think so.
Not sure. It's on the top floor of Trades Hall, so it was quite comfortable. We had the plumbers down the corridor, and the painters union, I think, were beside us for a while. And anyway, we got a phone call one day saying what had happened at the SGIO building is that above the ceiling panels, on the ceiling, it was all sprayed with asbestos. And the building owners had done some monitoring inside and said, "Oh, there's no risk. The levels are low enough." Mind you, at those days, the levels were set by experts, without any worker involvement, and the levels would have resulted in 10% of the population exposed at that levels to suffer from an asbestos-related disease. That was considered acceptable, that 10% of the population should suffer from that. So, yeah, they weren't very stringent standards either. But they said it's okay. And we got a phone call saying, "Can we have a look at the monitoring?" We went down there, and of course, as we do, we said to workers, to the telecom technicians, "What do you do here?" And they showed us. And what they did was not what an office worker does sitting at a table, but every time you got a promotion in the SGIO building, you used to get a desk closer to the window. So what would happen when you got a desk closer to the window, do you remember the old telephones? They'd have to move the telephone. To move the telephone, they'd have to move the telephone line, so they had to drill up through the floor. So they would get up in the ceiling space, lift up the ceiling panels, throw the cables across, hit the asbestos, which would drop down on top of the ceiling panels, as well as disturbing any asbestos that was already there. Then drill through the concrete and the asbestos to run the cables up through the floor. So their exposure was nothing like what the office workers were getting, which was calculated on a risk basis that one of the workers occupying the building anyway would have suffered from an asbestos-related disease. But these people were getting much higher exposure. And we found that out because we asked workers what they did. So the experts had been there, done the monitoring, which was absolutely not reflective of what they did. I started to say about my call out and why, and when I got a phone call saying, can we come up, there's something wrong at the SGO building on the 18th floor or some floor, I don't remember which. So ran down the road, went up to the SGO building, got out of the lift of the 18th floor and just gasped, because here on the 18th floor was a worker. Carpets had been pulled out, all the ceiling tiles had been pulled out, asbestos all over the floor, and he's in the middle of it with a broom, sweeping it up. And I just yelled, come down and meet me down in the foyer. And we got down and went down the floor, and I said, you know you're sweeping up asbestos there? He said, yeah, I know that. He said, I'm concerned about asbestos because my dad's lost half his lung to asbestosis. So I asked the boss about it, and he said they'd done monitoring here and it was perfectly safe. So that was the monitoring for the, for the office workers in that sort of condition. And this was sort of pretty typical of what was happening around the place at the time. With asbestos, as I said, our aim was to inform the rank and file. It was a rank and file driven campaign. The ATEA, to their absolute credit, took exactly the same approach, and they passed on the information to the rank and file. We ran courses for the rank and file about the risks of asbestos exposure. Helen's work here in terms of the body in the workplace and the way the lung works. Branch, for example, nudibranch means naked gill, and it comes from branchiole for the lung. So anyway, and her descriptions of the lung and how it worked were really important. So what happened is it also, one of the other things it did, it brought together unions that often didn't talk to each other. Unions from different political backgrounds. And the Workers' Health Centre was being separate from the trade union in a way, being independent, was able to bring those people together. So we had the ETU, the NTU, the BLF, the goodness only knows, but just all unions from different political perspectives coming together and also fighting each other's battles. So the ATA, which mightn't have been, the ACOA, which mightn't have been particularly strong in an area, could tell the ATA technicians about the asbestos in the building, or they would tell them, and action would be taken to try and get the asbestos removed. And it was run by rank and file. We learned so much from the rank and file. I remember going into the old T&G building in Brisbane after the asbestos had been removed, and one of the technicians said, come down. He said, they haven't done a good job. And we walked down, and as he walked through the car park entrance, he jumped up and asbestos. And I thought, oh God, he's planted that here. He can't have done that. Can't have just found it like that. That guy took us through the building and he showed asbestos where this is supposedly removed, where I would never have thought to look at it. He'd go into a riser, open the cupboard doors, there'd be cables running down. I'd look at it thinking, that's okay. He'd flick the cable and you'd see the asbestos fall out behind it. On the cable channels above, which is what he'd picked up, there was all asbestos has just been dropped on there and not removed. He was just like a sniffer dog, sniffing out, well, hopefully he wasn't sniffing it out, but finding the asbestos around the place. And it was just incredible to see the skill that he had at doing this by understanding the building. So understanding their expertise was really important. In fact, a number of the real estate agents approached those workers to help them identify where there was asbestos in their buildings. So the other thing there was the importance of national collaboration. We linked up with Workers' Health Centres elsewhere. We learnt a lot from them about how to approach that. I won't go into the details because of time. Volunteers. We had people that volunteered in putting together our library for us, in providing extra staff, in helping with research. As well as that, we had professionals who provided, Greg Miller, who would do a lot of asbestos monitoring for us, a whole lot of things like that, which we just relied on immensely. Obviously, the profile expanded. We took the same approach to hazards generally, and in particular the right to know and to have material safety data sheets, which now are accepted in the workplaces, but in those days you just didn't get. There was a dispute. Helen reminded me just a second ago of Weeper. We had some interesting experiences there. One of them was the ETU. The workers there had 2 drums of solvent, red drum and a blue drum. And they approached us to know what was in these things. We asked the company for a material safety data sheet, they wouldn't provide it. We managed to find out from other sources what was in the drums, ended up being the same drum. So they banned the blue drum. And they said, we won't work with that stuff until you give us a material safety data sheet. Sometime later, I was actually in WEEP and I said, how did that dispute go? And they said, well, they wouldn't give us a material safety data sheet, so we banned the red drum as well. And then we thought, hello, we've cut our nose off to spite our face. We use this solvent to clean electric motors and so forth, when we're working on them. What are we going to do? And so one of the people who'd been here for a fair while remembered we used to use a steam cleaner to clean the equipment. So we got the steam cleaner out and we started using that. We found out that it works better than the solvents anyway. So the drums are still banned, but we now use the steam cleaner. Material safety data sheets became a right to workers later on. So yeah, so the training we've talked about, and the success obviously is very dependent on rank and file activities and the rank and file willingness to actually do things.
Right. So a second area of work that really emerged early on was around new technology, particularly in the office, and now it's doing good. In fact, I get a feeling that we've completely forgotten the rules about ergonomics, and everybody's got laptops and sits there with their shoulders like that and wonders why they get a sore neck, and so I don't know if it's over. But anyway, clearly this whole idea that every time something changed in a work environment, it would generate its own set of hazards, and the need to understand that. And this was at the time of computerising workplaces. What emerged, the first big issue to emerge was what was then called repetitive strain injury or overuse injuries. They usually emerged because the change in technology allowed the practice to change, so people could do much more, and particularly predominantly women with much higher number of keystrokes would then aggravate their tendons and lead to problems. So then we had to look at the question of ergonomics, which was not a common conversation. Now, they'd done a lot in safety, I think, about making sure you don't press the red button if you, as opposed to the green button, and that sort of idea with ergonomics. But this was about applying workplace design and helping workers themselves assess their own risks. There was a real problem with this. It was where the application, I think, of discrimination in the workplace, and it was assumed that because there was women, that was, they were softer and not so strong, and they were just being precious about these injuries, whereas they're quite really substantially damaging. And I think this is where the interaction with medicine, I think, was a challenge, because you really needed to engage. It was a difficult conversation in getting clinicians to understand and respect the need for it, and then also what you do about it. Produced a lot of compensation challenges as a result. We also hosted a support group, and Shane Wild was instrumental in that, and who's gone on to do other great things, particularly in the LGBTI community. But that support group was encouraging workers themselves who were suffering injuries to talk amongst themselves and to work out how to deal with their compensation and their medical challenges, learning what they could do to help each other manage this particular condition. That sort of self-help approach. So it's quite consistent with this idea of empowering individuals with information, with support, for them to be able to do things, in this case in a group.
Can I just come in there, because as well as that we did take it on structurally, because
Yes.
the workers' comp was so dismissive and so destructive to those women. So I had the flexibility of opening a clinic up on the terrace that only saw RSI, people with RSI. One of the people in the centre was the person out the front, so we were all internal. And we assisted those people, but also we documented everything that the workers' comp did to them and how destructive it was, and wrote it up and presented them with what arseholes they were. And they changed. They actually changed their behaviour. So it was, we also had the flexibility to go and get them when we felt we should.
So it was necessary to apply, that's what I think you will explain what I was getting at, the medical system as an advocacy process rather than an institutionalised health service per se, but the importance of seeing what the big structural change that was needed. Bringing in of new technology also caused significant stress as well. And I remember one case of situation was with the fire engine dispatch centre. Did you come with me on that one? It was great. It was really interesting. So what they did have was these are people who took a phone call and they would have to dispatch the fire engine to whatever call out. And obviously when it's raining you get a lot of calls because of alarms accidentally going off and the like. So they had a board where they would switch lights on and off when an engine went in or out. So it's quite old technology. So then they changed it to a computer-based technology. And they had two screens. They had one screen where they put the information in from the caller, and then they'd have to shift to another screen that would tell them whether a fire engine was available, where to dispatch them, whether to dispatch them from one part of the city or the other. They could reroute them. And this night, I think early on, it took 7 seconds for the screen to shift over. And we just thought, here, it happens. But 7 seconds when you can see all of the calls that are banking up of people needing a fire engine dispatched. And this guy, it broke person that evening. It broke him because he knew he could do the job when he had it in front of him, and he couldn't do the job, and he just walked out and he couldn't go back in. And it was a really challenging approach, and it was way in which you just redesign workplaces and you don't actually talk to people about what impact it's having on themselves and how to mitigate stress and how it can really break people. And also the other big change was office-based work, was air conditioning. So we had a lot of calls about, not only temperature but stuffiness and that sort of thing. This seemed to be a national problem of air conditioning being a problem. So together with Lidcombe we produced some resource on air conditioning. I think it was the only one really around. I didn't think even internationally there was much around it except in the Office Workers Handbook. But really how to take measurements, how to measure temperature, how to measure airflow, how to ask the right questions. But it was interesting because dealing with an air conditioning problem was all about asking workers, well, what's the problem? You didn't actually have to measure it. You just walk around and say, well, you're sitting over, so you'd be sitting here and say, well, what's it like here? So, well, it's great, except in the afternoon it gets cold. And you go to this person and say, well, what's it like in your workplace? They, it gets really stuffy. So there's in the afternoon, so there's lots of air over here and none over there. So given there's an airflow problem. I remember one time going into one place and we didn't have our equipment yet. We were looking for a sling psychrometer, and we hadn't got it. And we had a Draeger thing. We walked in. All I did was walk around asking people, because I knew that's the way you start. We always started every job saying, well, tell me your experience. What is it you're concerned about? And you walk around and talk to people, and you get this enormous rich information about what's happening. You didn't need high-powered stuff to measure. But anyway, I did have this box that I didn't really get out till the end. And we had a series of standard questions. How is the air conditioning system designed? How do you monitor it? How do you clean? Are you cleaning the filters? Are you managing Legion? These are standard questions that if you understand basic understanding of systems, you would ask. Anyway, I didn't hear back from the union after we'd been in. But 6 months later, I thought, well, what happened? And they said they just came in, brought a whole lot of people, redid the air conditioning system. So they were obviously frightened of us. So that was quite empowering. Really, they didn't even measure a thing. But didn't even write much of a report up and say, could you please get us information on all these things? Anyway, so air conditioning was another example where you start with people's understanding and experience. Now, this is not, when I say it, it's not unique to workplace health and safety. It's just a fundamental principle about dealing with issues.
We changed the number of times air's recirculated through the system. So it used to be recirculated almost forever. we're now getting it down to 4 and 6 times.
Yes. And the interesting, if I might now add it, the later career impact was when we looked at COVID. And I know, because I've done some work on tobacco in the work in the air-conditioned environment, that the air-conditioning standards were appalling still 10, 15 years later. And when I started to try, and because I was doing stuff on COVID-safe plans for the Chief Health Officer, and I started to talk to people about doing old style stuff. What can we do about air conditioning systems? And you talk to them now, and still the standards are poor. Better, but still not sufficient to be protective of health as much as we would hope. So there's still work to do. Anyway, so that's an that was one big whole area of technological change, and being at the forefront of that was a really important part of that work. And we happened to come in just at that time, and again it was another issue where we were I think ahead of the rest of the field of occupational health and safety, and we certainly together with workers were able to shift the conversation around issues.
Okay. I just will mention quickly too there that the way that that the Workers' Health Centre was organised is that we were basically a collective. So the jobs that we did were decided among us. We'd allocate, as a group, we'd get down and allocate who's going to deal with this request, who's going to deal with that request, and so forth. So unless it could just be handled over the phone immediately.
There was one time I thought, this is not going to work. We had one of the asbestos issues was on the Thomas Harley, remember?
Yes.
We went out, and I got allocated. That was great fun. I went out with the big fella from the Federated Iron Workers, and from the Siemens, and from the painters and dockers, and me too, really big fellas, and all the people from the employers were all male too, and I was sort of out there. And then, what was his name from the painters and dockers? Oh, we'll get you in on the whole monitoring of the removal, and I thought, that's when you shower with your clothes on, shower with your clothes on. Not with that, no. I thought, no, I'm not doing that.
Okay. Next one over, so.
Sorry.
Okay, so we're also involved in a lot of advocacy work. We've already covered some of this, so I won't cover it all. The workers' compensation stuff, Helen spoke to, so that's good, because I would have only just mentioned that we'd made a submission, and Helen gave a bit more detail to that, which is great. We also participated in both state and federal government legislative reviews, so we made submissions on the National Occupational Health and Safety Commission and to the state government reviews when they started talking to unions. One of the things we did was develop the ALP policy on health and safety, which was quite important. Wasn't a lot of original work of that. I got that job, and basically I plagiarised some work that John Matthews had done, only understanding 3/4 of it probably. So that was really important, because that actually, when the Labor Party did come to government, they actually adopted that policy and implemented most of it, which I'll talk about a bit in a minute. We also worked with unions to try and get health and safety committees established in unions. We didn't have much success in Queensland at getting health and safety agreements established. I think Redbank Railway Workplace Shop was the only place I can remember. I think there was a couple of others that had health and safety agreements. These preceded the legislation, and basically what the agreements did was had really what the legislation's got in it now as rights of workers. The difference was that where they were negotiated, they were strongly defended by the rank and file, because it was something that they'd won. So when they had the right to stop work, they knew what that meant, and they viciously guarded it. So in a lot of ways, there's a lot to be said for that approach rather than the legislative approach, where it's handed down as if it's a gift to people, usually because of their activity anyway, rather than any real gift. Again, the emphasis was on the right to know and the powers of health and safety reps in all of these things, particularly the rights of health and safety reps to stop the job in conditions of unsafe work. Something which the employers feared dramatically, but in states where that existed, the surveys that had been done showed, and I imagine even more so now, show that it's an underused right that workers just don't use as much as they should use. When Labor enacted legislation in Queensland, it basically reflected the stuff that we developed in health and safety that we were arguing for in the training courses and things like that, and that we developed in the policy. The initial legislation, though, didn't include the right to stop work. It included health and safety officers, which is something that we hadn't argued for, and there are arguments about whether they're a plus or a minus. I sort of tend to think that they can be quite useful if handled well. I'm not going to explain what that is. If you don't know, it doesn't matter, I don't think. One thing that Queensland legislation had that no other state had is that it reversed the onus of proof in an offence. So an employer who was charged with an offence had a series of defences that they were presented with. And they had to prove that they were not guilty of the offence by saying that they had not guilty of the offence by using these defences to show that they had implemented proper health and safety procedures in the workplace. This was incredibly powerful. One of the things that never happened before is that employers were very seldom charged under the legislation and because they needed a watertight case. This reversal of the onus of proof changed that dramatically. That existed in Queensland for a long time. Interestingly, it was lost when we got national uniformity in OHS legislation, and the state that opposed it of all was a Labor-led state of Victoria, who then didn't sign up to the national coordination anyway. So Queensland lost that, which is a real shame. It was an incredible bonus for the state to have that reverse onus of proof. It wasn't abused. I mean, government's not going to abuse it anyway. They're going to side with the employers more often than not. But it did have that in there. It had as well the right to material safety data sheets, the right for information, consultation and things like that, which I think are not really implemented in most workplaces the way they should. It's interesting to note, in looking at material safety data sheets, on numerous occasions we came across material safety data sheets that were incorrect, falsified, and so forth, and yet I'm not aware of any prosecution for failure to provide correct information on a material safety data sheet. Helen might correct me if I'm wrong here, but I remember at GEC with the workers exposed to toluene diisocyanate, where one worker, a number of workers got occupational asthma. One of them, from memory, was told he would never be able to work again, and a number of others were severely incapacitated because of exposure to this substance. The first material safety data sheet that we got, if my memory serves me correct, was in Japanese. I think that's right, because the substance came from Japan. So we had other cases where the names of the chemicals were in Hungarian or something like that. But we had ways of getting around that. But yeah, so I'm not aware of any prosecutions there. There are also obligations on designers. I'm aware of a number of cases where workers have been injured and the designer has clearly been at fault, but again, the government just doesn't seem willing to take any action there. So I think it's fair to say that the workers' health movement as a whole and the Workers' Health Centre in Queensland had quite an influence on policy as a whole, but in the unions and in government. Sophie will probably go to this before. My one regret is that we hadn't had stronger influence on ongoing rank and file support and mobilisation. I think.
Thank you. So, and other people may also wish to chime in. These were just our reflections looking back. And I'm sure anyone who's involved with us may also have your own reflections about it. So what is the legacy of something like the Workers, or particularly the Workers' Health Centre? I mean, clearly we emerged at a time well before workplace health and safety became a sort of mainstream issue. And I think it was the work of Workers' Health Centres with the trade union movement that put it on the agenda and demanded that there be improvements. I mean, through ALP, a policy which led to legislation, such now that it's expected as a strong, supposedly, and I'll come to that, strong legislation to protect workers and the expectations that all workplaces have a good focus on workplace health and safety. There was a strengthening of employer accountabilities, and that has gone on with recent changes that place liability right throughout the organisation. The notion of translating science into understandable concepts, that it can be done and should be done to help workers in this case, but also that's translated into broader movements. The women's movement began with that sort of concept of we can understand our bodies ourselves, you know. Workplace health and safety, we talked about how we could translate highly technical scientific concepts into readily understandable ones, sufficient that you could manage what was around you. And as we go forward with all sort of public health issues, you want that sort of notion of translating technical concepts into way people understand and operate on the basis of that knowledge. Shifting the conversation about risk, which was, I think, excellent. I think people's tolerance for risk is not the same as it was. That if people harm workers, that is seen as a problem and that there will be action to a point. And these sorts of approaches, I think, influenced other institutions. Particularly, as I said, are moving on into environmental health and into public health, taking all of those ideas forward. And my comments, you'll see that I asked some of the same questions 30, 40, 100 years later, a long time. So, but I asked some questions. In a way, one of the challenges to why didn't the Workers' Health Centre keep going to the extent it did, there might be lots of reasons, but when you mainstream something and it becomes every day, that sort of advocacy, the need for advocacy is not valued to the same extent, or perhaps it's not needed. You need to move on to the next issue. So is that a good thing? Well, yes, it's great that we have much more research, much more professionalism in the field. There's a lot more experts in the field. There's a lot more employers and workers know a lot more about workplace health and safety. But is it working to how it should? And one of the things that distressed me in my final years in Queensland Health was the emergence of silicosis from kitchen benchtop workers, amongst kitchen benchtop workers. It would have to be one of the worst cases of workplace health and safety failure I'd seen in my career and brought me back to those asbestos days. We're talking a massive rapid growth of an industry, 30 to 50% of employees getting affected that had long-term effects. And these are young men, usually poorly skilled, who are ending up with permanent damage to their lungs, if not, it has killed some, quite a few. And this is an old issue. Silicosis was known before. And then you also, and when you looked at the conversation around it, it was exactly the same as what we're having around asbestos. You know, there was a complete denial of it. There wasn't the protection of workers, but also the weakening of rights of workers, I think, in small businesses, working in contract situations in the building industry meant that they were poorly protected. And it was interesting because sitting in a health portfolio, and I had because at that point I was chairing the National Environmental Health Committee, and it had come to us and come to the health departments because the workplace health and safety people hadn't reacted. And it was the Chief Health Officer of the Commonwealth who and I were talking about it. He said, if this was a communicable disease, we would be all over it. All over it. You know, 300 case deaths or something was anticipated. I forget excuse the figures, but they were really large figures. And so you say, well, and the resistance of the workplace health and safety system to reacting, to properly controlling it, was appalling. And I sat on the national task force on this, and you know, I felt like to think that 40 years before I'd been advocating to see such a tragedy emerge when supposedly this system was robust. But when it comes to the more complex, it was a new technology problem. It was a chemicals, not a safety problem. So we've now got obsessed about safety and forgotten about chemicals again. So we worry about tripping hazards, and you get You know, you get all this bureaucracy now around health and safety, but you don't actually get proper intelligent analysis of the risk. Anyway, I think weakening of union power is fundamental to that. And then you also get the debate about science itself, and that context has changed. We didn't say the science was wrong, but we challenged it. We asked big questions of it. And usually there are advocates amongst the scientific community. And I'm thinking of the asbestos stuff, because we were going back again on the asbestos work with the silicosis and looking at the history. And you had the researchers in asbestos related disease, and Selikoff being an American, the most famous American, had the same challenges that the tobacco industry, tobacco advocates had, that climate change advocates have. That story of challenging the science, but it's become more pernicious, I think. So, whereas we didn't challenge the research, we just asked that more be done, or it be interpreted, or the risk profile be changed, or the conversation be different. But we actually valued all of that with scientific research. So I think the application of science now is something that is really quite challenging in this environment, with people sort of getting sort of kind of crazy about it all. So I think that it was the final, yes, that was the final slide. So other people may be thinking, well, what it meant for you might be something completely different. So it'd be lovely to have that conversation as well as any questions.
Any questions?
I might just, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you for that. It was really, really interesting. I'm just thinking of the situation with so much casual employment these days, how that situation, I'm guessing, is probably deteriorated in terms of getting information to workers and also reporting what's happening with workers.
Well, the COVID risk was obvious.
I couldn't hear.
Casualisation of the workforce. So
Casualisation's been, well, with casualisation you get poorer working conditions, lower levels of unionisation. All of those things have an adverse effect on health and safety, and you generally find, and you still find even increasingly, that these workers suffer the worst health effects. In particular, stress-related is a big issue that arises in a casualised workforce, because the jobs tend to lack any kind of sort of positive feedback or creativity. They tend to be repetitive, poorly paid, etc. All of those things coupled together just increase stress levels. I think I'm probably telling people that already know this anyway, but we often hear about executives being stressed. Executives suffer symptoms of stress because of long lunches and too much drinking. Workers suffer their symptoms of stress from real stress. Boring jobs, repetitive jobs, lack of feedback, those sort of things, which really have a big impact. A bit of an aside, but I just mentioned an example. When Sophie was talking about the overusage, it reminded me, and just understanding why workers do jobs the way they do. One of the jobs we had was at the keystrokes in the tax office. The unions had a campaign of Go Safe, Go 8000. When you saw those tax officers on a keyboard, you could not see their fingers moving, they were going so fast. It was just a blur. And part of the thing of reducing overuse injuries was to reduce the speed of keystrokes. Unions had a campaign of Go Safe, Go 8000. Employers agreed to Go Safe, Go 10,000. So we had to then go into the workplaces and run a campaign asking workers to slow down. Now, I got doing one of these talks, I thought, fantastic, I've got to go in and tell workers to go slow. I'll go out of here hero, I'll be carried out on people's shoulders. In fact, I almost got lynched. Does anybody know why? It's the importance of understanding why people do things the way they do it. Sorry?
Bonus payments for productivity?
Bonus?
Bonus and productivity, no, they kept all of that. That was actually foreseen.
Okay.
Could be their sense of mastery.
Yes, yeah, job satisfaction. When you're doing a repetitive job like that, the only way you could get satisfaction out of it was to do it faster than somebody else. And we were taking that off them. So we had to go back and redesign the design of the work to give them satisfaction, look at things like job rotation and things like that. And interesting, that also brought it at the same time we had the 10-minute rest break, 10 minutes an hour off. And I remember at the time we were discussing it at the centre, and we said, why have they got, what's the scientific evidence for that? And I remember bringing up, I can't remember the ergonomist's name now in South Australia, well-known ergonomist who published a paper on it. I said, what's the scientific evidence of this? And she said, seemed like a good idea at the time. So we stuck with it. It seemed like a good idea at the time. But yeah, so casualisation really has just so many negative impacts. Casualisation often comes with contracts as well. Contracts, having work contracts in the academic area for some years, are just dehumanising, having to reapply for your job every 3 years. And aside from, certainly where I worked, you'd have a person concentrating on building up what they needed to build up to get reappointed rather than actually contributing to what you were doing in the workplace, stuff like that. So it had negative impacts on productivity, that then more stresses and so forth. So yeah, hate casual work. Well, no, some people it suits. There needs to be, I know my partner would kill me at the moment because she doesn't want to work full time, but part time is better than casual. Okay. Any other questions?
You guys put some documents on the back table. Do you want to just explain what those are?
Okay. So at the back table we've put down copies of all but one of the hazards that we produced over the time. Flicking through some of those might just trigger your memory into some of the campaigns and issues that you will probably involved with as well, which is interesting. There's also a series of posters from some of them are from Victoria Trades Hall Council, and some of them from the Workers' Health Centres. One of the things that happened as well is we formed a national Workers' Health Cooperative. I think Helen used to attend that mostly, where we coordinated our activities nationally, which was very important. We have standardised reporting and so forth. There's also some leaflets from the Workers' Health Action Group. Aside from the Workers' Health Centres, there were also a series of Workers' Health Action Groups, rank and file groups started around the country. So there was ACTASHAG, the ACT, Occupational Health and Safety Group, OSHAG, the Occupational Health and Safety Group, the various names that they had around the country that were sort of rank and file groups organised around issues. So they'd often be fairly short-lived, bring together a series of activists and get together around things. There's some minutes of some of the later meetings of the centre. I'm not going to look at them. There's an example of one of the more detailed reports, the air conditioning report that we produced with the support of the ACOA. So there's a number of documents there. There's also the old Workers' Health Centre door sign that comes from just out here, and of course the poster. And this was interesting. This was a mural on our wall at the Workers' Health Centre. Oh, it was a lot bigger than that, but one of the volunteers actually painted this fantastic mural on one of the walls, which we had to leave behind when we moved from the Old Trades Hall, which was a real shame. Yeah.
If you were in charge of the world, looking at the current settings with the legislative workplace, what appears to be a quite large bureaucratic infrastructure around health and safety, what reforms do you think are needed now? And at what level? Are they local, legislative?
Well, I reckon I'd be approaching the unions and getting to organise their health and safety reps better. Now, this could be a parallel delegate structure, if you like, but not to usurp delegates' power, but to look at those people, to properly resource them, to let them know about issues, to organise them around issues. I think that would be. It always disappointed me that unions never saw the benefit of health and safety representatives and organising them properly. I mean, they take them to courses and so forth, but a lot of unions don't even have a list of who their representatives are, for goodness sakes. They need to be.
Because they've got the power to stop work.
Well, they've got the power to stop work. They've got the power. They've got a group of people there who are, by and large, interested in health and safety.
Yeah.
Some of them see it as a step to management, but by and large, they're interested in health and safety. So, get them organised, provide them with information, develop campaigns, start initiating campaigns, build up union membership, get these people active. To me, it's not about the legislation. It's about that rank and file organisation.
Whereas I compliment that, no argument with that at all. I actually think there's a fundamental, we made a mistake in entirely, and I've got a complete bias here, entirely placing it in industrial relations without oversight. So it's both mining failed with pneumoconiosis, workplace health and safety systems failed in terms of silicosis. Why? Because they lost track of oversight of somebody else reflecting or holding them to account. They got rid of their board in workplace health and safety. So there's no challenge back, and it wasn't until, I mean, we shouldn't have had to have anything to do with it in my old job. It was something that workplace health and safety with the health department. We shouldn't have had to have a say. But what happened in the end is we started collecting the data, and so I think that if I was still there, I'd be actually arguing for a separate monitoring system, pull the monitoring out of the departments while the departments keep on with the managing of the legislation. So you have people worried about, I know that epidemiology is at the end of the day not preventive, but you need data to start looking at where the patterns go wrong, to have a really energise looking at the problems that are emerging, and to have a charter to do that. But in the hands of the current health and safety system, it's too institutionalised now, and it doesn't want to change. And so when we said to them, well, you could do, one of the examples, you shouldn't be able to operate, like you can't remove asbestos unless you've got a licence, right? You know what you're doing. You shouldn't be able to operate a kitchen bench, cut up a kitchen bench top without a licence. Oh no. Regulatory burden, you're thinking,
One of the
I'm not allowed to swear.
one of the things that we had in the ALP policy that was never implemented was an Occupational Health and Safety Commission, and the role of the commission was meant to be an independent body that advised government but oversaw the operation of the Department of Workplace Health and Safety, or whatever it's going to be called. I blame myself that we don't have that, because when they started implementing the policy, I got rung up and asked questions about it, and they said, how important is the commission? I didn't understand it properly. I plagiarised it basically from some work John Matthews had done, and said, the board will probably play that role. I didn't really understand the role that organisation was meant to play, but that would have maybe done something. But again, I don't think that's going to operate unless you've got that rank and file sort of simmering, activity and concern anyway.
Sometimes when you've got a disempowered workplace like these small businesses, you also need other things. But I suspect the board, because your original vision was right, there was a board. Well, they used to have a board. It had people from various walks of life. They kicked off independent people, so it became employer union. That's fine, but then they didn't have other people who could advise. That got kicked off, and then they just got rid of the board at all. Do they still have the board? I don't think they do. All of that sort of and you do need oversight, because this is a regulatory system, and regulatory systems can get tired and get regulatory capture. So you need other people. So that's known for every type of regulatory system.
But also within industry, things are constantly changing. So you're introducing new machinery, new processes.
Yes.
And they're relying on the old machinery and processes that have been analysed and understood. But because they've introduced new procedures, it changes. And they don't understand where those changes affect. One of the things that I've been seeing coming through your talk all along is that once you get up into management, they don't understand what the guys in the field do. So one of the things that I was always trained is, whenever we do something, we've got to get out into the field and we've got to understand how it affects the guys.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm being sexist there. How it affects the people working in those processes. It's most important. You see it very rarely. I was fortunate, I worked in an industry where they valued that. But constantly, I can remember talking to my superior many times, and he would often say to me, "Oh, Peter, I don't understand what you were doing."
Yeah. Doesn't it piss you off?
Yes.
In terms
talk about
of what
values.
system checks and balances, does the workers' comp outcomes have any kind of
Not
ripple
enough.
effect back
Not
to
enough.
No.
rules and
Not
behaviours,
enough.
and why not?
Well, they don't. They work on an individual level.
True, but they've got that collective.
Don't.
They get a fine and they pay the fine and then they just move on and keep doing the same thing.
Yes.
And then
Their
there's this
concerns
whole,
about
this regular capture stuff goes on,
Yeah.
which is, you know, well, we don't want to tell anybody what's going on, that the workplace sort itself out, oh, they said they're going to do the right thing. Well, there's a limit to that. Sometimes, in some places, they are horrified and they will do the right thing. But you've got to be smart enough to figure out, if you're a regulator, to have enough distance to be able to say, well, no, you're not doing the right thing and we're going to now get grumpy with you. Well, you know, so I'm just concerned that, and also the resourcing in government, the expectation. Everyone keeps saying, we'll get more inspectors out, but it's just not going to happen.
One of the big problems with that system is that the employer writes the accident report.
Yes, I
And
understand.
invariably, the cause of the accident is worker carelessness. It is never, ever, ever a cause of an accident. This is, you know, this was one of the big battles of the Workers' Health Centre, and it used to be commonly thought that workers caused accidents. You know, that it was worker carelessness, and this was by union officials, by workers themselves, by everybody. That was a huge battle we've had, and we won it for a while. And then the profession, the health and safety profession, reintroduced it under the guise of, I can't remember now, behavioural safety, behaviour-based safety. And this is really blame the worker again. And really, and you know, it should be, I actually saw one case, in fact, in a nickel mine in North Queensland, which where we were there, and a supervisor came in with a report to the manager, and it had on it cause of accident worker carelessness. And the manager said to him, never ever put a report with this on my table again. Go back and find out the real cause. I almost fell over the back of my seat. That's the approach that should be taken. Workers don't go out to injure themselves. I remember going to a talk by a guy called Safety Dave. He had to be an idiot from the start, but he was promoting behaviour-based safety, and he was using a research based by a guy called James Reason, who's a psychologist, who points out that really we are creatures of habit. We can only drive a car when we don't think about it anymore. When we hand over the subconscious to the control. You know, remember, you know, kangaroo hopping down the road when you're first trying to work out how to release the clutch and things like that. It's only when you can do that subconsciously that you can actually drive a car. If you want to have an accident, run down some stairs and think about what you're doing. Think about what your feet are doing, because you'll fall. Okay, it's only when you can do it subconsciously that you can do the job. And that's the same in industry with a lot of the jobs that we do. The trouble is that if something changes, you put a marble on the step, or you change the height of a step or something like that, then you're bound to have an accident. The guy called Safety Dave, I remember one of the slides he was showing to show how stupid workers were, basically, was at a double-decker bus with a conductor hanging out of the window, this is just wrong in so many levels, but eyeing off a beautiful looking lady walking along the street just as the bus is about to go through a very narrow tunnel. And this was supposed to be an example of worker carelessness or behaviour, unsuitable behaviour. What about the design of the bus that you could hang out of the bloody thing in the first place? You know, so totally misses the point of what of the environmental causes of accidents. So yeah.
If I could just follow up and then I'll stop. I think that's been transmogrified into the wellness
Yes.
approach
Absolutely.
Yes.
to workers' health, where the complete capture of HR departments and these bureaucratic, it's now become greater mindfulness.
Yeah.
It's
We always
to
had,
help you manage everything.
we always
So
had
I
big
think it's
arguments with
kind
the
of
health promotion
become
people about
all
those.
I know. I had a
Develop
few.
resilience.
Yeah, we won't go.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions. Barbara had a question, and then Lachlan had a question.
Well, actually, Terry, you took the words right out of my mouth. So I was going to start with the one thing that I learned from you. The first thing, the most important thing that stuck up here was there's no such thing as workplace accident. And from all of that, I'd just like to reflect that as a worker for a union, I became you know, it suggested that you might want to come along to this organisation and join it and represent your union. So I did, because I knew some people with the Workers' Health Centre, and this was in the later years. And you go, oh, I don't know much about this, but you know, I'm enjoying myself. And it suddenly sinks in, and more and more and more, and I managed to take it back to the union. And it was such a pleasure to be able to refer back to the Workers' Health Centre for, you know, for smaller things that people would ring up and say, God, it's hot here today, I can't do this. Oh, well, I just happen to have some information that came from the Workers' Health Centre. And you know, you could help there. And I also realised that our industrial officers, who are just brilliant people, workplace health and safety was not the be-all and end-all for them. That came much later. If you went along and you did study industrial relations, there was barely enough. And by them having, you know, greater access to the Workers' Health Centre, it educated them into realising how powerful it could be. So I thank the Workers' Health Centre and all of the people who worked there and built it and kept it going for such a long time.
I'd just like to follow up with Barb by saying that the legacy of the Workers' Health Centre is felt to this day, I think, in workplaces. And I'll just relate two incidences in the university sector. I worked with Barb in the NTU. There was a massive reorganisation of the library at the University of Queensland, which...
Which one?
Well, there were 17 of them, but there was one which revolved around the installation of a book sorting machine. And anyway, there was jobs going left, right and centre, and anyway, we had a health and safety rep in the library who put a pin on the machine, which meant that they had to have some workplace health and safety audit of the whole process. It really put a spanner in the works and actually was an effective organising tool for getting rank and file union members involved in addressing the issues around the restructure. So it was very positive, and I think it did show the importance of having educated union health and safety reps on the job.
Yes.
But to follow up Barb's point about the industrial officers, the ability to conduct audits of workplaces by the union was an important component of the legislation, subsequent legislation. And when there were very stressful situations of workplace bullying and harassment, our industrial officers could conduct audits under the legislation in association with the workers in that place. And there was a number of those in the university sector that the universities did not like it because we were quite powerful, and complained to the department. The department came out and said the union did all the right things, but it did have consequences for the health and safety of workers in those workplaces. Their working lives did improve as a result of those audits. So I think, again, it's a positive story about the impact and the legacy of the Workers' Health Centre. So thank you.
Thank you. Look, everyone here. I'll join with Barbara and Lachlan in thanking you as well, and saying that you've provided a fascinating history of the Workers' Health Centre. It is important, as both in terms of that it be on the record the accomplishments and the legacy of the Workers' Health Centre, which is important to know about, but it's also, I think, a model of organisation that can be applied to a number of other areas of union activity as well. So it's been really fascinating. I think we probably could have continued the questions and discussions for quite some time, which is a tribute to how thought-provoking it was. So thank you very much.
Yeah.